Good day and welcome to today's UT School of Social Work webinar, Victim Notification in Cases Involving Untested Sexual Assault Kits, What You Need to Know About the Brain and Trauma. Our speaker today is Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who is a professor of psychology at Michigan State University. She holds a PhD in community psychology with a concentration in statistics, also from Michigan State. For the past 25 years, she has been conducting community-based research on violence against women and children with an emphasis on sexual assault. Dr. Campbell's research examines how disclosure and help-seeking affects victims' psychological and physical health. Most recently, she was the lead researcher for the National Institute of Justice-funded Detroit Sexual Assault Kit Action Research Project, which was a 4-year multidisciplinary study of Detroit's untested rape kits. But before we turn things over to Dr. Campbell, I want to welcome Caitlin Sully, who is a research project director at the School of Social Work's Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. She currently oversees research initiatives focused on interpersonal violence, victim-centered practices, and the criminal justice system. She also provides technical assistance around victim-centered practices within the criminal justice and advocacy fields, and she has served survivors of sexual assault and family violence in law enforcement and community-based settings. So please welcome Caitlin Sully for our program today.
Thank you for the introduction, Matt. I wanted to say a few words about IDVSA to get us started. Our mission at the Institute on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault at the UT School of Social Work is to advance knowledge about interpersonal violence through research, education, and service in multidisciplinary strategic partnerships with researchers, educators, practitioners, policymakers, and other members of our community. So our vision is for our efforts to enhance the quality and relevance of research findings, their application and service provision, and ultimately their benefit to survivors of interpersonal violence and those who assist them. So we approach this work from a multidisciplinary focus, and we are a partnership between the Schools of Social Work, the School of Law, the School of Nursing, and the Bureau for Business Research. We have a Office on Violence Against Women grant to provide training and technical assistance around the issue of victim notification with untested sexual assault kits. So the opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the authors, and they don't necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice or the Office on Violence Against Women. As part of our victim notification training and technical assistance project, we are able to offer this 6-part webinar series throughout 2016, and we'll also have a victim notification guide published this fall, which will be available publicly. And lastly, we provide technical assistance around the issue of victim notification, which is free and available to anyone undertaking victim notification in their community and their jurisdiction. So you can find more information about our project on the IDVSA website under the Programs tab. I'd like to take a moment to thank Dr. Campbell for presenting to us today and for her contributions to our field, particularly with helping us to apply the science of neurobiology of trauma to our practice around reaching out to survivors and sharing information with them about forensic evidence in their sexual assault cases. I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Rebecca Campbell.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good afternoon or good morning to all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules today to attend today's webinar on the neurobiology of trauma and its implications for victim notification. And that's actually the order in which we're going to be covering the material today. We're going to kind of front load on neurobiology of trauma and then back load on the implications for victim notification. So what I'm going to be doing in the time that I have with you today is we're going to start off with a basic introduction to how the brain and the body react to trauma. Then we're going to focus on 2 specific brain-body loops. The first is on how the brain and the body process trauma in regards to emotions and behavior, and the second is in relation to memory, recall, and formation. Finally, as I mentioned, we're going to bring it back and talk about implications of this material specifically for victim notification. My goal today is to share with you the science behind trauma so that you are better informed about the underlying science of trauma, which will help put you in a much better position to support the survivors with whom you'll be working. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to do a brief, painless, non-technical introduction to the neurobiology of trauma so everyone's not feeling like they're overwhelmed with a little too much science today. The way we do this kind of research is that we, meaning researchers like myself, are often waiting for folks to have major traumas. We might be in partnership with a large research university and their emergency department, and after someone has experienced a major trauma like domestic violence, sexual assault, witnessing a homicide, other types of violent crimes, after they've received the medical care that they need, we might ask them to participate in a research study. So again, after they've received care, would they be willing to work with researchers to help us understand what's going on in the brain and the body? So what we might be doing is an fMRI scan, like what you see on your screen, so we can see what parts of the brain are more active after a major trauma or less active after a major trauma. We might supplement these fMRI scans with blood work and urinalysis, again, to try to understand brain-body connections in major traumas. So what we've learned across a wide variety of research on many different types of traumas is trying to chart which sections of the brain are active or less active in a major trauma. And one of the first things we figured out in this body of work is that there's a part of your cerebrum, which is the gray squiggly top part of your brain, that's particularly impacted in all major trauma, sexual assault included, and that's your prefrontal cortex. That's the section that I just circled right here in red on your screen. It is the front of your brain. It is right behind your forehead. Now, what you do in your prefrontal cortex normally is you do complex decision making. You bring together different information in your head. You remember things about what you should do, what you're supposed to do, different information that might bear on what you ought to be doing in a particular moment. You weigh pros and cons, you make a decision, and you execute a decision. So a lot of really complex pieces and parts of things come together in your prefrontal cortex to help you make decisions and then execute decisions. Now, what we've learned across a variety of research studies is that for folks who've experienced major traumas, this part of the brain is less active than usual. So during the trauma and in the immediate aftermath of the trauma, the prefrontal cortex is less active. There's less activity there. What that means is that the brain's capacity to do that kind of complex decision making is really compromised. So for all of us who work with victims, it's not really reasonable or fair for us to second-guess decisions they might have made or say, I wonder why they did this. Why'd they do that? Why'd she call a cab after she was sexually assaulted? Because the decision-making processes for people in a trauma and in the aftermath of trauma are different than when they're not in a state of trauma. Literally, the circuits in the brain that do that decision-making in the prefrontal cortex are shutting down. So we need to be understanding of how victims make decisions and realize that the decisions they make in that moment and the aftermath may not necessarily be decisions they would make later on. They're very much affected by the brain's response to major traumas. We've also realized that there's other structures in the brain that are affected by trauma. So this is now sort of a cross-section of the brain slicing top to bottom. And underneath the prefrontal, underneath the cortex, the gray squiggly part, you can see some of the older structures of the brain, older from an evolutionary standpoint. So all those different pieces and parts you see on your screen there do things like help your heartbeat, regulate blood flow, make your lungs work, very primitive things that are about keeping you alive. So it's actually pretty interesting then that many of the other structures that we have figured out that are involved in major traumas are in this older part of the brain. So let's take a quick minute to talk about some of those. There's 4 key structures in this older primitive part of the brain that are very active in major traumas. First and foremost is the amygdala. The amygdala is about 1 inch long. It's almond-shaped. It's that little blue dot that you see on your screen. And the amygdala does 2 primary things. It helps you process emotional reactions, and it helps you process memories in response to threats to the survival of the organism. What do I mean by that? Think of it this way. Your amygdala is a structure in your brain that is scanning your environment for things that could kill you, things that could be life-threatening. And when you have one of these experiences, one of these major traumas, the amygdala essentially fires off and puts into motion two loops, if you will. One is to help you deal with the emotions and behaviors of this trauma, because chances are you're afraid, you're terrified, and we need to have a behavioral response that helps keep you alive. And we need to remember it. So there's going to be a loop entirely about memory. We're evolutionarily wired to try to remember traumatic memories so that if we do indeed survive them, we can communicate these to others and help protect ourselves and others from similar threats. So now let's take a tour through each of these two loops. The brain-body loop that pertains to emotions and behaviors after major traumas, and then the brain-body loop that goes down memories. All right, so let's start off with emotional reactions and behaviors in major traumas. So the amygdala, as I said, is going to fire off when it recognizes that you're in a potentially life-threatening situation. And one of the signals that it's going to send right away is to a structure called your hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is just an information switching station, if you will, in your brain. It's something that helps communicate other structures. And the hypothalamus is going to be communicating specifically with your pituitary gland. That's the purple blob that you see there. Your pituitary gland is the master gland in your body. It's the place you get a signal to if you need to signal another gland in your body for a hormonal release. And hormonal releases are a key way the brain-body works for regulating emotion and behavior. So specifically in a major trauma, what we see is that the amygdala kicks into action what is called the HPA axis. And this is probably an acronym worth remembering. So the amygdala fires to the H, hypothalamus, to the P, pituitary, and then your pituitary signals down to your adrenal glands, which you see there on your screen. They sit right on top of your kidneys. Now what your adrenal glands are going to do in a major trauma is respond by secreting different hormones, chemicals, to help with this emotional behavioral response to try to help keep the victim of this trauma alive. Now, across a variety of different kinds of studies, we've been able to figure out that there are 4 major hormones that are secreted by the adrenals. Different people secrete different combinations of these. Some don't secrete all of them. The concentrations can rise and fall. So I'm speaking now kind of in generalities, that it's safe to assume that victims of trauma are going to have some combination of these 4 hormones. So first, we have catecholamines. Catecholamines is adrenaline. So in a major trauma like sexual assault, domestic violence, the body's going to get a burst of adrenaline. That's to give you the potential for fight or flight. I'll come back to why I'm saying potential in just a moment. But the idea here is that the catecholamines could give you the energy to fight back against this threat to your survival or to flee, to get away from it. But I said potential because it's a little bit more complicated than that, because you also have to know what's happening with the cortisol. Cortisol is kind of a complicated hormone to explain, but generally speaking, you can think of it as an energy, a hormone that affects energy available to the body. So depending upon the combination of catecholamines and cortisol, the body could have fight, flight, or freeze. Meaning for some folks, the trauma response behaviorally isn't to fight back, it isn't to run away, they freeze, which it can also be a very adaptive strategy in terms of trying to keep the body alive. So the best way to think about how to describe a trauma response is fight, flight, or freeze. Now it's really important to understand that people don't get to decide whether it's fight, flight, or freeze. So even though a few minutes ago we were talking about the prefrontal cortex and decision-making and things like that, that's not what's happening here. This is a hormonally driven determination of behavior, fight, flight, or freeze, based on the adrenals. So people aren't deciding, should I fight, should I flee, should I freeze? It doesn't work like that. This is the body's behavioral response to trauma, fight, flight, or freeze, and you don't get to pick. Now again, for those of us working with survivors of violence, sometimes that freeze response in particular can be very confusing to them, and they can feel like that they did it wrong, that they didn't fight back the way they were supposed to, and they can carry a great deal of confusion and shame about that response. So it's really helpful for all of us who work with survivors of violence to know that the science actually tells us it's fight, flight, or freeze. and that freeze is every bit as normal a response to a major trauma as fight or flight. Now, these other two hormones that are on your list here have to do with pain regulation. So in any of these major traumas, chances are there's going to be some pain involved. So thankfully, our bodies are hardwired to help us with that. And one way that happens is with an opioid release, which is basically morphine. So the body might be getting a big blast of pain meds, essentially, from the adrenals to help get through the pain of this attack or of this trauma. Now, the thing about opioids is that they most certainly do block the pain, but they kind of block everything. So in a very high opioid release, behaviorally, what we're going to see is victims who don't show a lot of emotion, have very flat affect, and basically can describe really horrible things that have happened to them with almost no emotion whatsoever in their voice. And again, important for all of us who work with survivors of trauma to understand that sometimes, even though we might be expecting a crying, sobbing, hot mess, when we see someone who's very calm and not showing a lot of emotion, that's every bit as much of a scientifically grounded trauma response as somebody who's crying. Now, this final one, oxytocin, is kind of an unusual hormone as well. This is one that blocks pain through kind of a different mechanism, if you will. Instead of trying to push down the pain, which is what opioids do, oxytocin tries to block pain with essentially a counterbalance maneuver by pushing up positive feelings, good feelings. So in a very high oxytocin release, a victim of trauma will be sometimes laughing, smiling, giggling, maybe talking about the person who's harmed them in incredibly loving, caring ways because it's a bonding, positive feeling hormone. Now again, the body's just trying to block the pain, the betrayal, whatever the emotional or physical pain might be going on. But again, behaviorally, what that does is it gives victims this presentation that sometimes can be very puzzling to those who are working with victims because they could be acting like, no big deal. They're laughing and giggling. But again, the science tells us that is a very common trauma response. So let's apply some of this specifically to sexual assault. What's the brain-body loop for sexual assault in response to emotions and behaviors? Well, like I said, first off, the amygdala is going to detect the threat. And it's worth just pausing for a quick second and emphasizing that for sexual assault, the amygdala does fire off. So this is one of those traumas that is the body perceives as something that could be life-threatening. So whether it's a stranger sexual assault or a non-stranger sexual assault, our research tells us that the amygdala fires under either of those circumstances. Because sexual assault is a very invasive crime to the body, it has the potential to our brain and body to be life-threatening. So it is going to be what we call an amygdalic-controlled response. So the amygdala is going to fire, activates the hypothalamus, and the HPA axis is going to kick in. So again, all of those hormones that we just talked about are going to be put into play. So particularly when we see a high catecholamine release, that fight or flight, for victims who have that kind of very high hormonal release, we're going to expect some impaired rational thought from the adrenaline. We're going to see them be pretty hyper and jangled. We would also expect to see from the opioid release a lot of victims showing very flat affect or no emotion at all. And again, for those who have that oxytocin release, the laughing and joking. So all of these different reactions are possible, and I'm sure many of you have worked with sexual assault survivors where you look at that list and you say, I've actually seen victims do all of that. I'm sure you have, in and out, cycling back and forth as their hormone levels rise and fall over the course of your interactions with them. Now, for sexual assault in particular, sometimes the hormonal flood is so strong, so sudden, and so complex that the body actually tips over into more of a complete shutdown. Sometimes this is called a fear cascade, where it crosses over from a fear response into something much more profound where the body is really shutting down during the trauma. And this is called tonic immobility. Tonic immobility in the context of rape is often referred to as rape-induced paralysis. It is an autonomic response, which means it's uncontrollable. It's a mammalian response, so it's not just humans that do this, and it's something that happens in extremely fearful situations. It is behaviorally marked by increased breathing, eye closure, but the most marked characteristic of tonic immobility is the immobility. They can't move. So they can't move their legs to kick, they can't move their arms to push, they can't move their mouths to make speech. So they are awake, completely aware of what's happening to them while they're being sexually assaulted, but they can't do anything. It's not a blackout. Victims who experience tonic immobility describe this as being awake in surgery. There's nothing they can do. They know what's happening to them, and it's absolutely terrifying. Between 12 to 50% of rape victims experience tonic immobility, and most recent research studies are finding numbers a little closer to that 50% mark. So you should assume about half of the victims, a little less than half of the victims you're working with have experienced tonic immobility. This is a quote from a rape survivor talking about what tonic immobility felt like, and I think it's important for all of us who work with survivors to sort of see it from their point of view. She said, "I was terrified. I couldn't do anything, and I didn't know why. I didn't want to tell no one because what would I be able to say? No, I didn't fight back. No, I didn't yell for help. I just laid there, wondering if I was going to die." So again, this quote really illustrates what tonic immobility is like for the sexual assault survivor. I just laid there wondering if I was going to die, absolutely terrified. What we also see here is sometimes the reluctance and the worry about seeking help, making a report to the police, because she says, no, I didn't fight back, no, I didn't yell for help. She knows that those are key questions that she's most likely going to be asked, and she feels like she's not going to have the answer right. No, she didn't do those things. No, she didn't do those things. But her body responded in the way that it needed to help keep her alive. Tonic immobility can be an evolutionarily adaptive response in keeping you alive. And that's what her body did. But the problem is the law enforcement officer with whom she did interact with when she did file a police report didn't know about tonic immobility. And this is his characterization of her case. He said she just laid there, so she must have wanted it. So yeah, I closed the case, marked it as unfounded. Nothing can be done. So this really highlights how it can be very problematic if those who work with survivors of violence don't know about the neurobiology of trauma. So this is a kit that wasn't tested. This is a case that was marked unfounded, and it was a very straightforward case of tonic immobility. But the officer in charge of this investigation didn't know that and made a fundamental attribution error regarding the victim's culpability in this, when really what was happening was she was having a neurobiological response to trauma. So what are some key take-homes about emotions and behavior for us to keep in mind? Once the HPA axis is activated, it's going to stay jacked up for about 96 hours. That's 5 days. And it also reactivates when the memory gets reactivated. So I want you to tag this because we're going to come back to this idea when we talk about victim notification here in a few minutes. When you reactivate the memory, you reactivate the HPA axis. And when you reactivate the HPA axis, here's what you got. You've got the strange emotions, the emotional mood swings, irritability, argumentativeness, difficulty concentrating from the catecholamines. The longer those hormones keep continuing to produce at high levels in the body, there's going to be physical consequences, headaches, body pain, stomach distress, insomnia. A lot of victims turn to drugs and alcohol for self-medicating behaviors to cope with those behaviors because they feel cruddy. And then unfortunately the alcohol or drug use does help them feel better temporarily, and that becomes a vicious cycle. And again, the longer the HPA axis stays jacked up, the longer the prefrontal cortex stays quiet, we're going to see compromised decision-making, particularly in interpersonal relationships, human relationships, and the like. So our key goal here is to get the HPA axis quiet again, get it turned off. So the primary way that we want to do that is by providing caring emotional support. No matter what discipline you're from, the goal is to think, given my disciplinary perspective, given the role that I have in the process of reporting, prosecuting, and supporting victims, how can I provide emotional support to this victim? Now, it's probably going to look different in each of our disciplines, and that's totally fine. But the goal is to say, within your discipline, what can I be doing to offer emotional support? Because simple statements like, I'm so sorry that this has happened to you, I'm ready to listen to you, simple expressions of caring actually really do help the HPA axis calm down. The sooner we get that calmed down, the more likely, the sooner the prefrontal cortex can come back on board and we can have more decision-making capacity for folks. We also want to give victims informational support, but oh boy, we really need to give them time. Please tag this point too. We're going to come back to it in just a few minutes on victim notification. Once a traumatic memory has been activated or reactivated, information that you're pouring into them at that time may not really be processed very well at that time because the prefrontal cortex is shut back down. So we need to give victims options, but we need to give them time to make decisions. The more that we try to push them into decisions quickly, the more likely it is they're going to say, no, I don't want to do this, simply because their brain is saying, I can't handle all of this, never mind, forget it, shut down, we're over. And finally, we want to connect victims and advocacy support services by name. What do I mean by that? It means when you're working with victims, either now or in notification, you're not going to want to refer them to the name of an organization, and certainly not to an acronym. I know all of us have acronyms for our organizations. I'm no different. We've got the SAP program, the SAS program, the SAPR program, the SASHA program, the this program, the that program. Now, those of us in the service provider community can probably rattle those acronyms off the top of our head, run them off, and we know what they mean because we use them all the time. But chances are the people we're working with don't know all those acronyms. The thing is that people don't seek help from acronyms, and they certainly don't seek them from acronyms they don't know, and they also don't tend to seek help from organizations that they don't know. So the goal is to be making referrals by name. So I really want to connect you with Caitlin. Caitlin is a great advocate. Caitlin's part of our team. Caitlin's going to be able to give you some more information. We can set up an appointment for you to talk with Caitlin in more detail. How many times did I just say Caitlin? About 4 or 5. That's what I'm talking about. You're making a referral to a person, a name, and you're vouching for that person. So the goal is behind the scenes in your notification teams and your SART teams and your multidisciplinary teams is to figure out who's the name you're going to be using, who are you going to be putting people in touch with to make that very personalized referral. Because when you make a personalized referral, it significantly increases the likelihood that the victim actually is going to follow up and connect with that person. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about the memory loop. Remember I said there's 2 main loops that go into motion after a major trauma. We just finished talking about the emotional and behavioral loop. Now let's pick up and talk about the memory loop. So again, I said our key structure here is the amygdala. The amygdala also fires to the hippocampus to start this memory process going. So that hippocampus that you see there on your screen is that green sort of boomerang-y shaped thing. And what your hippocampus does is it helps make memories for you. All kinds of memories, good memories, bad memories, traumatic memories. And the way memory usually works is that as you're going about your day, your hippocampus is getting information from the 5 senses. What are you hearing? What are you smelling? What are you tasting? What are you hearing? What are you touching? And the like. And what it does is it encodes that. Encode is sort of the technical word for writing down, capturing all of those different pieces of sensory. But then it's got to organize them and group them to say, oh, well, this is my memory of that webinar. This is my memory of my vacation at Disney. So it has to sort them. That's what you see there is the idea of consolidating, grouping the stimuli that pertain to a particular memory together and then storing them together so that these are all my dots pertaining to my trip to Disney. These are all my dots pertaining to the webinar. These are all my dots pertaining to something else. So that each of those dots come together, they consolidate in your memory, and there's essentially a label that's put on it. My memory of this, my memory of this, my memory of that. This is how memory usually works. Here, the emphasis, because trauma doesn't work that way. When we have an amygdala-controlled response, when the hormones fire from the HPA axis out of your adrenal glands, the normal memory processes don't work quite the way they're supposed to. And most specifically, what happens is that consolidation step gets messed up. So instead of all the different pieces and parts of the trauma memory coming together, consolidated and labeled, essentially what happens is this. So the traumatic memory is a complete disorganized mess in the head. It's there. Let me emphasize that. It's there. The memory's there. If alcohol is on board, yes, there's going to be holes in the memory because that's what alcohol does. Alcohol interferes with encoding, the writing down, the tagging of the pieces as they come in. And then the trauma interferes with the consolidation. So the memory is going to be fragmented, but it's generally going to be there unless alcohol is on board, in which case some of those dots are going to be empty. There's just not going to be bits and pieces of the memory there. So again, applying this specifically to sexual assault, the stress hormones that happen for sexual assault, which again is particularly strong, the memories are going to be fragmented. So when victims are trying to recall the memory, whether now or whether years later, it is often going to be slow and difficult because they're basically trying to find all of those different dots and all of the different pieces of their memory and answer the questions that are being put before them by law enforcement, an advocate, or the prosecutor. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the research is very clear that the accuracy of the memories is okay. So the trauma hormones don't interfere with the accuracy. It interferes with the storage of them. And there's also no evidence to suggest that they decay over time. So again, with victim notification, which could be years later, there's no indication from the science that the quality of the memory itself might have decayed over time. Some specific context details could get fuzzy, but core pieces of the trauma itself doesn't seem to decay. So let me share with you just very briefly sort of what this memory fragmentation is like, again, from the perspective of the victim. This is how victim describing her interview with law enforcement. She said, he wouldn't let up, pounding me with question after question, trying to trick me, trying to get me to mess up. I wanted to say, hold on, give me a minute to think, but he kept coming at me. She goes on to say, and then it was classic good cop, bad cop. He, the one who was asking her the sort of rapid-fire questions, stormed off, and then another detective sat down next to me. He offered me a cup of coffee. Coffee? Okay, fine. How do I take it? What? Why does he care how I take my coffee? Well, he did. He made me coffee, and he gave me time just to sit and collect my thoughts. And we talked it through, and I didn't feel rattled and freaked out. I'm sure I was incoherent, and he just let it roll. He was patient. I felt like I was piecing it together, like a puzzle. We were putting together a puzzle and drinking coffee. So this is a great example of what memory fragmentation looks like from the victim's point of view, and it shows a great example of law enforcement sort of working with that. The second detective did a much better job of showing empathy, giving the coffee, giving her time, and he's letting her talk, and he was patient, and he let her roll, and she's putting together a puzzle. She's finding all of those dots and pieces of her memory. So this was a much more effective way of getting the information from her. So what are our key take-homes about this? Those trauma hormones create fragmented memories. The story may come out sketchy or sounding sketchy, but the content's really okay. But again, the problem is that sometimes victims, when they're trying to explain it, and they're so back and forth, and it seems like they're not sure what's happening, sometimes it's interpreted as evasiveness or lying, and in those cases, police are less likely to believe victims and less likely to investigate. And actually, that is something we have found is a core reason why so many cities in the U.S. have large numbers of untested rape kits. When you read the police reports associated with those kits, what you see is a lot of things like this. Well, the memory seemed sort of fragmented. She couldn't answer basic questions about what time it was. Things that are very likely attributable to the neurobiology of trauma, but weren't interpreted that way. So the case was closed and the kit wasn't tested. So what are our key take-homes from this? First and foremost, do not make victims tell their stories over and over again. It tends to drive the HPA axis back up, tends to stress them out, tends to make recall more difficult. It's really a good idea to let them sleep before they do an interview, 1 to 2 sleep cycles. That is true for an initial report. We've also found in Detroit it can be helpful at notification too, that after the notification they have time to absorb it before coming back in for a more in-depth follow-up interview. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The memory will come together in time. You just need to have some patience. And it's important to use trauma-informed interviewing methods. Now, it's beyond the scope of what I can do on that, but I will try to weave in a little bit about trauma-informed interviewing as we talk about implications for victim notification, our final section of today's webinar. So I've been sharing with you how it happens for current cases, what happens in the brain and the body for assaults that are reported in 96 hours. But actually everything I just said also applies to cold cases. New evidence reopening a case, a SAC has been tested, and there's a CODIS hit. Because remember, whenever you bring up the memory, you're reactivating the trauma. Okay? So from the perspective of the victim, a cold case can actually feel like a current case. So the passage of whatever it was, 2 years, 5 years, 9 years, that can disappear in a heartbeat for them, and they can feel like they are right back in that current case. Because fundamentally, victim notification from a neurobiological perspective is the reactivation of the traumatic memory. And whenever we reactivate the HPA axis, we get all of these things that could happen. We could be triggering flashbacks. We could be exacerbating PTSD symptoms or other mental health issues they could be having. For those who are struggling with substance use and abuse and relapse, a reactivation of those traumatic memories without adequate support could be enough to worsen their substance abuse, or if they're currently sober, it could trigger a relapse. So this is very sobering for all of us doing victim notification to really think about what does it mean from a neurobiological perspective to activate a traumatic memory. Now, the good news is there's lots of clues and information from this research that can help us do notifications in ways that are trauma-informed, and we can really minimize the likelihood of any of these negative consequences. So we're going to need to think through victim notification protocols, victim interviewing techniques, and comprehensive victim services. These are the three key things that we need to make sure are informed by the science of the neurobiology of trauma. So what does the research tell us is the best way to do victim notification? It hasn't really told us that yet. There's really not a lot of research on this. My colleagues in Detroit and I did some. Caitlin Noel and her colleagues in Houston have done some. The Joyful Heart Foundation has talked with survivors across the country, but we don't yet have sort of the definitive answer. So what we have is a lot of different ideas and strategies that are empirically supported that suggest what we know about trauma, this is what we think is going to work and should work. So empirically supported guidelines. Number one, really important to have a multidisciplinary team forming your protocol. There are very complicated legal issues that go into notification, and sometimes that can start to tip the notification protocol to have a very strong or maybe too strong of a legal focus. But again, it's a reactivation of traumatic memory, so we need to tip it back and make sure that our colleagues from social work and allied disciplines are at the table to make sure that these human perspectives regarding trauma are also reflected in the protocol. It's important that we're focusing on victim well-being, and there's a little trick here. The research on victim engagement in the criminal justice system is actually very clear on this issue, that if you focus on promoting victims' health and well-being, attuning to their emotional well-being, making sure that they're feeling okay, that is actually going to increase their participation in the criminal justice system. So by focusing on their health and well-being, which may not seem like a very legally thing to do, that is actually how you're promoting potentially their engagement with the criminal justice system. It's very important to empower victims through choice and control. And I appreciate that those words might feel a little funny coming out of the mouths of some of our colleagues from different disciplines, empowering, choice, and control. But again, it's actually empirically supported that the more choice and control we give victims during the notification process and give them time to make those decisions, the more likely it is that they will re-engage with the criminal justice system. So that's really important. And we really want to think through, do we have adequate supports for survivors during the notification, after the notification, which means you need to have all your ducks in the row before you start doing notification. Do you really have all of the service providers in your community aware that you might be doing notifications, victims might be needing services? What are you doing before, during, and after to make sure that you've got the supports in place? Now, the literature also tells us that the time of the notification might not be the best time to do a re-interview with the victim. You just reactivated the trauma, the HPA axis is firing, This is probably not the best time for them to try to remember the bits and pieces of the trauma. So there's a couple of different ways you can handle that. One is sort of a two-step model, one where you have a briefer first contact with survivors, work with them in getting connected to advocates, family, and then have a second interview when they've had a chance for it to settle in. Or if it's all going to be done in one fell swoop, make sure that you've budgeted enough time and space for the survivor really to calm down and let it settle before you try to do the interview. Again, that's that 1 to 2 sleep cycle thing can really make a big difference. It's important for your notification personnel to be watchful of different trauma symptoms and reactions. Now that you know more about what an HPA axis activation looks like, you're going to want to be looking for those in a notification. And again, using some simple de-escalation techniques that I'm sure your colleagues in your community from social work, rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters can be teaching folks. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's really important to not press victims for decisions. They need time to take this in. I appreciate that they could be in a time-sensitive situation and things like that, but the more choice and control you give them, the more likely it is they're going to re-engage. Now, when it is time to do victim interviewing for victim notifications, you're going to have to go back into the guts of the case, so to speak. You're going to want to use techniques that work, and one of the techniques that's not going to work is Reid method. It's a well-established method in police interviewing, but it really was designed for suspects. It has very closed-ended questions, very focused questions, and it teaches that inconsistent statements are lying. This is not what you want to do with victims, either for the original report and certainly not for a victim notification interview. What you're going to want to do instead is some type of trauma-informed interviewing where you're really connecting and trying to understand the fact that the memory is scattered. So you need to use techniques that are really about trying to capture as many of these dots as so to speak. So in general, who, what, where, when, why questions are too small. They're too narrow. They're too focused. You're not going to be able to get a lot of information from victims about this. Again, either at the original report and certainly not at a victim notification years later. What you're going to want to do instead is use open-ended, sensory-based questions. Here's an example of one. This was developed by Russ Strand and his colleagues in developing the Forensic Experiential Trauma Interview, the FETI method. This is the first question, and with his permission, I'm sharing it with you today. He says that the question you would ask a survivor in an interview, whether it's now, whether it's years later, is, can you help me understand what you're able to remember about your experience? And then shut up. Don't ask follow-up questions. Don't interrupt them. All of those arrows that you see on your screen sort of jumping around are meant to convey this idea that if you don't interrupt the victim and just let the victim's train of thought come out in whatever order it may be, that's what's going to give you the best chance of collecting as many dots as you possibly can, as many pieces and parts of the memory. So even though you may be really focused on a specific detail around the assault, the identification of the suspect, you don't start there. You start with a much broader question about what they're able to remember about their experience and let them talk and let their brain go to pile after pile of these different dots. You're going to get much better, fuller recall, again, both at the time of the original assault and at the time of victim notification. And then finally, for victim notification protocols, I can't emphasize this third component enough, comprehensive victim services. Survivors are going to need an advocacy buffer for continued contact with the criminal justice system. Again, the research is coming out pretty clear that victims whose kits were not tested very likely didn't have a great experience with criminal justice system personnel at the time of their original report. They may be very worried, they may feel very angry, and it's going to be really important to have that advocate there who can help negotiate and buffer that contact and really try to help law enforcement understand where the survivor's coming from and also help the survivor understand where law enforcement's coming from. It goes both ways. You're definitely going to want to think through what mental health services you have available in your community to address the long-term mental and physical health impact of the assault and the notification. There have been instances in some cities where notification did trigger something very profound for victims in terms of them needing hospitalization and immediate care. This is a rare occurrence, but it is something that you do need to have in place as part of your protocol, and let folks know and be communicating with those in your community who do that kind of emergency and then long-term care. Ditto for substance abuse services. Because this could be a trigger for folks struggling with sobriety issues, again, it's going to be very important for your notification team to have some first name connections to key substance use folks in your community in the event that the notification and the re-involvement with the criminal justice system triggers some relapse issues for survivors. As always, it is really important that your services are culturally appropriate. And particularly in the context of victim notification, it's quite likely that years ago when this assault happened and the victim made his or her first report, perhaps the services that they were interacting with were not very culturally appropriate. Things have gotten better. We still have a long way to go, but have gotten better. So it might also be important to help communicate to survivors and connect them to services that hopefully they would find much more culturally responsive now as they start to move forward potentially with the criminal justice system. So a couple of conclusion thoughts I want to wrap up, and then I want to make sure that we have time for questions from all of you today. So I hope today's information has given you some insight into neurobiological reasons why victims behave the way they do, and I think it can give us some real important insight into how we can improve health outcomes and notification experiences for survivors, and so that the work we're doing is victim-centered and trauma-informed. I want to share with you one final quote. When I do interviews with survivors, I usually ask them at the very end, when I am out doing trainings or webinars with practitioners, what message would you like me to carry forward? What would you like me to tell survivors? What would you like me to tell practitioners on your behalf? And one survivor said something that really captured the sentiments of many survivors that we've heard from. And she said, when you're out doing trainings and your things, tell them this. Tell them that everything you say, everything you do is a chance to help me or hurt me. Make the choice to help. Please help me. So it's a very sobering thought for all of us, that everything we do is a chance to help or to hurt. Small comments, little comments can make a huge difference in the lives of survivors. How we behave, how we interact with them. They can read a lot into it. Sometimes they overread into it. So we need to do what we can to center ourselves, to focus ourselves, and to really be present when we're working with survivors and make every choice a choice to help them. So I thank you for your time. We're going to open up for some questions now. Here's how you find me. There's my email address. There's an alternate version of this webinar on the National Criminal Justice Reference Service. If any of you might be doing other trainings in your community on the neurobiology of trauma, or would like to share this with others in your community, my colleagues and I did some YouTube videos primarily geared for the law enforcement community, but they really do work for multidisciplinary audiences, which is basically the neurobiology of trauma in a short version, and there is a link to how you can find those, and those are public domain. So I will pause here and work with Caitlin now on trying to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. We have one very specific question so far, and the Q&A box is open if anyone would like to type in any additional questions at this time. Our first question is, for you, Becky, can you speak briefly to how other substances like ecstasy, Rohypnol, heroin, methamphetamines, Xanax, or cocaine might impact the four brain chemicals the hippocampus functions?
That is a really good question, Ashley, and the short answer is we don't know. And the reason why is that we don't have a substantial body of scientific literature that's been able to look at these processes for victims who are or are not under the influence of alcohol, ecstasy, Rohypnol, and on and on and on. So the short answer is we don't know. The slightly longer answer is that we have no reason to suspect it's going to be anything good. So alcohol, we talked about, is going to impair the hippocampus's ability to encode information, meaning write information down. So when the victim recalls a memory of a trauma that happened under the influence of alcohol, some of those memories are just, they're not there. It's like a blank dot, using that analogy. We would expect absolutely the same thing for any type of drug that is specifically designed to impair memory, like Rohypnol. So what we're going to see there is also large chunks of the memory just being blank. Now, there's still going to be some memory fragments there under alcohol, under Rohypnol, and things like that. And again, that's all the more reason why it's important to use trauma-informed interviewing methods, because those tend to go for sensory cues. And actually, if you use more sensory-based interviewing, you're going to get better recall. So the victim may not be able to remember at first key things like time, date, but if you start talking about senses, what they felt, what they smelled, the smell of the beer, the smell of the drink, sometimes reactivating those sensory cues will actually start to pull more of the context information they do have out of their mind. Now, in terms of ecstasy, meth, Xanax, cocaine, I don't know. I really don't. Those drugs can work on multiple systems in the brain, and sort of that's also why it makes it harder to study them, is because they put more systems of the brain into place. So I don't know what it would do for brain neurotransmitters and then how that would affect HPA axis activation.
Thank you, Becky. It's a great question, Ashley, and we can work on gathering some more information on that issue. We still have a few more minutes. If anyone has any other questions, we'll wait to see if any more pop up in the Q&A box. I'd also like to refer attendees back to the IDVSA website under our Victim Notification Program page for links to research on victim notification. On that page, you'll find the links to Detroit's research, the Houston research, as well as the compendium of resources on this issue from the National Institute of Justice. All right, we have another question. You talked about advocacy and the importance of the support from advocates, but could you specifically talk about the community-based advocacy importance, the victim having access to an advocate that has confidentiality under VAWA?
Yeah, we looked into that in the context of the Detroit Project, and again, for just background and context, there's a place for both community-based advocates who can offer victims confidentiality under VAWA, but also for systems-based advocates that can help victims coordinate and understand different pieces and parts of either the investigation or prosecution process. In the Detroit Victim Notification Protocol, we utilized both, but for notifications, we utilized community-based advocates. And the reason why was exactly what you're suggesting in your question. We wanted victims to have a confidential space where they could talk about what they were thinking, what they were worried about, in ways that they knew was going to be safe and protected. So the notifications, the initial time, when victims had a chance to absorb this information, they had the chance to sit down and talk with a community-based advocate who explicitly told them, the information you share with me is confidential. I cannot and will not repeat it unless you do the release and that kind of thing. That was incredibly well received by the survivors. In our evaluation data, survivors liked having the opportunity to talk with someone in a confidential setting. Did it create some tensions within the notification team? A little bit, but honestly, people were able to work through it. Because the investigators certainly wanted to know. They wanted feedback. Am I doing it okay? Am I not doing it okay? And they really wanted to know from the advocates, what could I be doing better? So we had to think through ways that the advocates could provide general feedback, but without violating the confidentiality of any one particular case. So as you're thinking about your victim notification protocols, again, keep in mind a time and place for both types of advocates. But again, for survivors' health and well-being in Detroit, our data were pretty clear that having a confidential advocate was critical.
We have another question. Do you have any recommendations as to how to approach a notification in cases when the statute of limitation has expired?
We did a few of those in Detroit, and I've talked with folks across the country who have tried some of those. I think it's really important in your protocol to sort of think through why you're doing the notification. In the Detroit team, we developed a planning tool to help communities think through the development of their protocol, and I'm happy to share that with Caitlin, and it actually may already be up on your website, I'm not sure. But one of the things we talk about in that planning tool is why are you doing notifications? And if the statute of limitations is expired, why would you be reaching out to the survivor? And there could be reasons that you're doing that. One of them may be because it hit to a current case, in which case you're basically either FYIing and letting the survivor know that the assailant raped again and you're going to be moving on a different case. It may be because you're going to need that older survivor, the survivor from that first case, to testify in a current case. So there could be very complicated issues regarding that survivor's involvement in a subsequent case. So you're going to have to think through that. Then there's the issue maybe that there isn't any action that's going to be taken, and you're simply going to tell the survivor that, you know, your kit wasn't tested, and the statute of limitations is expired, and there's nothing that can be done. There's quite a bit of debate in the practitioner and policy world about whether notifications should be done in those circumstances. I don't think there's research that tells you to do it one way or the other, or you should or you shouldn't. But there is research on the psychology of apologies that I think is really relevant here. So that if your notification protocol is to go ahead and notify survivors for whom their statute of limitations is expired on their case, I think it's really important to think through how the notifying personnel can offer an authentic apology to the survivor, to let him or her know that they are sorry that they were assaulted, they were sorry that the kit wasn't tested, and that they were sorry that there was no other legal recourse that can be done. But they wanted to let them know in the hope that it would provide some psychological closure to them. All of the same things we talked about in terms of providing services and support are just as critical for those survivors as those who will be involved in continued criminal justice system involvement. So I think it's important to kind of pause and think through what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what your community stakeholders think about the importance of apology, as that would be a very trauma-informed approach for handling those kinds of notifications specifically.
That's an extremely helpful resource that we will be including in the notification product that we put together that will be available in the fall. So we will make sure we get any other questions answered after this webinar. We had one final one come in, but I want to thank Becky so much for applying the science of the neurobiology of trauma to victim notification for us today. I'll turn it over to Matt to close us out.
Okay. Well, that is going to conclude our session. I'd like to thank our speaker for her participation and all of our registrants for attending today's program. You can get registered for on-demand recordings of past webinars and also upcoming live programs at UTAustinSocialWorkCEU.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.